I would like to welcome our plenary speaker, Randall Davis. He is at the University of Utah, but you also might recognize his voice. He's been on the web continuously since 1998, so you probably have interacted with some of his materials or activities in some form or another as a teacher. And he's going to talk to us about his 6 keys of surviving and thriving as a teacher in the pandemic. We're so honored to welcome him today. And with that, I will pass it over to Randall Davis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining this conference, the ability to share ideas across, you could say, in some ways, dimensions, sharing today across geographic boundaries as well. And I'm really excited also, just so you know what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be sharing some of the, I would say, concepts that have transformed the way that I see my own teaching and learning. And what I think is important as well is we're bringing on Sandra and Sue and Ramin to actually share their perspectives in the last few minutes of my presentation. I think it's so important that you hear local voices, not just someone from outside of your area, but people that are working in your area who can share some perspectives in relation to what I'm going to be talking about today. So let me go ahead and just jump into the presentation today. The title of my presentation is called Surviving and Thriving in the New Pandemic Era. And I would encourage everyone, let me bring that back up. I would encourage everyone who is watching to try to use the chat feature if you would like to share any perspectives, ideas. I certainly would like to try to add those to the conversation as well. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be bringing on 3 of your locals to actually share their perspectives as well. So let's go ahead and begin. And I want you to think for a minute. This is kind of a question to ponder. What have been the greatest challenges facing you, your institution, your students, and your families during this pandemic that is still going on? Feel free, again, to share any thoughts on that. And I think for many of us, at least in the beginning, it was a period of just uncertainty of how things would unfold. Certainly, there's uncertainty now as well. But I know that over time, for me personally, it's gone from a period of deep uncertainty, not only within my teaching, within my family, but just within life in general. And slowly, I would say, there has been some slow transformation of an awakening, of transforming to actually reach, in part, the end of some type of proverbial tunnel. And what I'd like to do today is, along with you, I'd like to share some ideas. Number one, I'd like to explore 6 concepts that have reshaped my teaching and my learning as a human being and as a teacher. And then propose a book or technology or other online resources that could be useful to you. Some of the ideas that I'm sharing today, I've shared over the years, but they kind of more or less coalesced, moved to the foreground in many ways because of the pandemic. So as I share these 6 concepts, I want to keep in mind that there is no one right key for every concept, for every situation, for every culture. But the ideas that I want to share today, I think, again, in keeping an idea of how to not only just survive in the pandemic, but to actually thrive, are some of the concepts I'd like to share today. First of all, I'd like to talk about the idea of realizing that I could be wrong about so many things and not even know it. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce this concept, because I think this concept is interwoven into everything I'm going to be sharing today. Some of you might be aware of this particular study. It was a study done by Daniel Simons and Chris Chabris over 20 years ago, and they were doing a study on inattentional blindness. And in this study, they had 2 groups. One group dressed up in white shirts and the other group in black shirts. And as part of the study, they asked the people that were watching it to count how many times the team in white shirts passed the basketball. What was so amazing, at the end of the actual study, they asked, how many ball passes did you count? But then they asked the participants in the study, did you notice anything else that was somewhat unusual? And one of the things that they didn't, that less than 50%, I think it was around 40% of the people that were participating in the study actually saw a woman dressed up in a gorilla suit pass across the screen, was on the screen for the total of 9 seconds. Only 40% of the participants saw it. And what was interesting is when they asked an additional group, if a gorilla actually entered the screen, was on the screen for 9 seconds, do you think you would see something so unusual? And 70% said that they would. But the problem with this, and again, you can actually learn more about the study and on the website, The Invisible Gorilla, there's actually a book called The Invisible Gorilla. But the whole purpose of this study was to help us understand that so often, so many things are right in front of us, yet we're blind to see them. So my first idea is realizing that I could be wrong about so many things and people and not even know it. Connecting this to the pandemic, sometimes we're so unaware of the benefits and challenges of online learning, not just benefits, but the challenges that are facing us. Also, and probably more important, is the emotional distress that students, that teachers, that parents, that communities experience as well. And someone is mentioning remembering seeing that particular video. Again, is a well-published study. Well, the idea is that, as I mentioned, sometimes we're so unaware of how unaware we are about work, about home, about relationships, and we have some type of illusion that we see the world the way it really is. And the problem with that is that thinking that we see the way the world really is can lead to misunderstanding and unneeded distress. For example, many years ago, I was in Saudi Arabia and I gave a series of presentations, this was 21 years ago, about how internet treasure hunts can revolutionize language learning. And then I realized that I didn't realize at the time of how limited the internet and resources were to teachers in that area. More recently, as I was speaking with a number of teachers, I was sharing ideas on online learning and teaching. And then a few people said to me, your ideas are nice, Randall, but you just don't understand the limitations of technology in our area, in Nepal, in Africa, in so many places around the world. But actually what happened is this idea of being wrong. One of my favorite books is called Being Wrong, and how disorienting, difficult, and humbling our mistakes can be. It is ultimate wrongness and not rightness that leads us to who we are. And so the idea of this is that as I started to think about these ideas, about how sometimes we don't perceive how life really is, the experiences that teachers have, that students have, I began to think about different books and resources. You are not so smart, or The Invisible Gorilla, or Being Wrong. And sometimes as we become more aware of how things really are, how little we actually see, then we actually can grow. And I think only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. So how does this relate to actually pandemic and our teaching and our students? Number one, accept the limitations and the boundaries of our knowledge, especially with technology and the pandemic era, and working with balancing and juggling family and teaching and learning. It has placed great stress on everyone. Being more humble and open to new ideas, and recognizing we don't understand the struggles of our students and our own colleagues. So that's point number one that I wanted to share. Point number two, and someone says, I want to read that. Again, they're great resources. I hope they are. And someone also mentions in the chat about another book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That's a wonderful resource as well. So the next point that I'd like to share is being authentic and vulnerable. Now, what does that mean? Well, if I could ask you, describe the pandemic in one word or less, would you be open enough to sharing the challenges that you've experienced? For example, I hate this. I feel frustration. I feel loneliness. I feel disconnection from people around me. And I think many times we're afraid to acknowledge some of the pain and struggle that we're experiencing. And I think the fear of disclosure, I know during the pandemic, a lot of fear of loss of employment, loss of connection, as I mentioned, loss of health can really heighten our anxieties. But I think a lot of times we're afraid to acknowledge that of how people might respond. It's kind of like we often wear ourselves out trying to be someone who we aren't or we aren't meant to be. We pretend to be what we aren't. We pretend to know what we don't know. And the reality is, I would like to be able to do this. And I would like to be able to do this. But the reality is, I don't know why my mom dressed me up in these pants and the shirt next to my brother's. I don't want to remember that. I want to be authentic in so many ways. And one of the things that, and one of the researchers that is a favorite of mine, her name is Brene Brown, who is a researcher on vulnerability, shame, and courage. And she talks about in one of her books, daring greatly. In other words, many of us live in fear, the fear of looking weak and flawed and imperfect. And sometimes we wear a mask of inauthenticity, especially during the pandemic, where you have many teachers around you that are saying, oh, yeah, you just need to use Zoom. And then you're realizing, to acknowledge that I'm not really sure of how to use Zoom, I think is really important that we recognize. Someone also is mentioning about exhausting, isolating are some of the comments. Loss of connection has been devastating for me. Someone mentions all of the above. Traumatic. Thank you for sharing those comments. One of the things that I feel and what Brene Brown talks about is vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And what the idea is, vulnerability leading to authenticity, what happens is that when we become more authentic with our students, and there's nothing wrong, I'm sure all of you recognize, there's nothing wrong with saying to your students, you know, I'm trying to figure out this technology. I'm not really sure of how things work. And to be honest, authenticity actually attracts real people, and it helps you wear the same face no matter what the circumstances. So what I want to do right now, I just want to be a little authentic with you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take away this green screen. Move it out of the way. This is what my house really looks like. I'm actually in the kitchen with a zucchini from my garden. So the idea, I think, when we become authentic to so many people, it really leads to greater authenticity and so forth. Yes, students like to see you trying and making mistakes. Great. That's an impressive vegetable. So again, the idea of being authentic, I think, is important. And one of the resources I want to share, first of all, from the first part that I mentioned, I think The Invisible Gorilla is a wonderful book. Again, there is a website called The Invisible Gorilla. And in terms of vulnerability, one of my favorite TED Talks, it's called The Power of Vulnerability. This was actually done in 2010, over 55 million views. It's a wonderful TED Talk of talking about vulnerability, about openness, and so forth. The next topic I want to talk about is talking about using technology judiciously during the pandemic era and beyond. And what I mean by that is even before the pandemic, I think there have been times where people have felt that technology is like a utopia. But often people feel of technology being like chaos, like technology might hand you a gift in one hand and then stab you in the back with the other. So one of the things that I've thought of over time is that whether we're in the pandemic era or not, and again, more and more people are relying on technology in different ways, is we have to, of course, decide on the instructional goals and aims and understanding the limitations of technologies in the area where you are. In other words, you might have in a classroom, I was talking with someone in Costa Rica, a teacher, who in some cases, some of the students have access to a lot of technology, but there are other students that live more in jungle areas where having a reliable internet connection is just impossible. So being aware of that, I think, is really key. So when you start thinking about technologies, you want to think about technologies that are very useful. Okay, well, USB mittens and a USB fridge, I've tried them both. They don't work very well, but they are possible to use and create. What I'm suggesting is finding technologies that can help students and teachers today in today's unique environment. And so as part of this, I often think about using the idea of the less is more principle. In other words, years ago, we used to have a 12-speed blender in our kitchen. And I would ask my son used to love making smoothies, and he would try to explain to me the difference between blend and puree and shred and cream and grind and chop. And I tried to tell him, I need something like this, a blender that only has an on and off switch. In other words, as we think about technologies today, we often want to make sure that we use only what we need, that's easier to support, that's easy to maintain for learners and students. And with that in mind, just because you can use technology doesn't mean that you should use it. Thinking judiciously of what you're using, and don't abandon what already works for you. Keep things simple, I think, is what is a real key to that. Don't abandon what already works for you. Now, what I like to do is I'd like to suggest some technologies that might be useful to you in different ways in the pandemic era. Someone is mentioning, good point, more bells and whistles don't necessarily make better teaching. So happy to hear it. Judicious use of technology. Thanks for sharing those comments. So let's take a look at actually technologies. And as I'm thinking of technology, ask yourself, will that technology work easily in a classroom of 50 or more students? Is it going to work in all situations that you find yourself in? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about simple technologies that could benefit you. Some of the technologies that I'm using today on the screen. And again, everything I'm going to show you can be downloaded from the website in the electronic program. I want to make sure that you don't have to feel that you're taking meticulous notes about some of the things that I'm talking about. But what I'd like to share with you is a couple of ideas that hopefully can boost your game, especially in dealing with microphones, that can increase the ability to project, to share your ideas with students and so forth. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share some ideas on microphones, pop screens, webcams, lighting, green screens. And what I'm going to show you here is this list. Again, this list is in the online handout that you can download. And the ones that you see in red are the ones that I want to share with you. So first of all, what I want to share is just about microphones. And I'm just going to actually stop screen share because what I want to do is I want to share with you. Actually, I'm going to bring that back here for a minute and share with you a couple of ideas. First of all, right now, probably the most important thing for you as a teacher is not the webcam that you're using. The webcam that I'm using is the Logitech C920. It's probably one of the best cameras online. It's about $70. But better than a webcam is often the microphone that you're using. What I'm using in front of me is what's called the Blue Yeti. But what I want to do is I want to recommend a really simple USB microphone. It is number 3 on your screen. It's under $25 and it has great quality. So the quality that you're listening to right now is very much similar to the simple plug and play. The nice thing is USB. It has a nice windscreen on the top. Excellent type of microphone if you want to increase the quality of your sound. The other thing is often teachers are thinking, well, maybe I need to get some type of pop screen so that it catches some of those aspirated sounds that are coming out of the microphone. Well, you can spend $19 if you want to use something like this. But what I do sometimes is I use an old pair of pantyhose. So I take an old embroidery hoop like this that you're seeing right here, take a piece of pantyhose over it. And what it does is that it catches, especially when I'm doing certain recordings, it catches those aspirated sounds that you might have, a very simple tool that you can use for that. The next one I want to share with you, again, these are the things that I've used since the pandemic era, is what I consider one of the best microphones for smartphones. This is actually called the Purple Panda. It is a small lapel microphone. And the nice thing about this is that the cord is really, really long. So if you're doing recordings or doing with Zoom, again, I use the microphone when I do Zoom. I use the lapel microphone. That was the actual Purple Panda, an excellent microphone that could be used for recordings that you might create. Couple of things that I'm using behind me. You see a green screen that I'm using as well. The right back behind me over there is actually number 9 is the softbox lighting kit. So all of these things that I'm recommending, like the Purple Panda is about $30, is that just can increase the audio quality. And I think the audio quality for many people is probably the most important thing. Again, I'm seeing some other comments that are coming up. So again, a lot of different things. One of the other things I want to point out is a side note, but a lot of times people are trying to use their smartphones for actually recordings, and they don't want to hold up a transcript. So this particular app, it is for an iPhone or iPad, but there are many things that are very similar to it, is where you can actually create a script, import it, and then you can actually be recording and reading the script on your smartphone. An excellent example of what you can do. And the last thing is that if you want a little tripod, you can make really simple tripods, like for your phone, something like this. So there are a lot of different ideas. Feel free to share any teaching tip or technology that you might be using as part of your recording. Someone mentioned that they heard of the app. What I want to do now is, again, all of those tips and ideas are found in the online handout on the website. But what I want to share with you is beyond technology, just some basic teaching tips that can enhance your teaching as well. Number one, look at the camera, not at the screen. And sometimes, often as teachers, we're constantly looking at our screen to see all of our students. But for students, they want to see and feel like you're looking right at them. That's one simple teaching tip to actually provide better connection. Come up with clear classroom policies and determine whether cameras are turned on or off. And I know there can be legal restrictions on when cameras can be turned on or not, but coming up with clear policies, learning how to use all of the features of screen sharing, I think are really important, no matter what platform you're using. If you're, for example, trying to actually read comments, like right now I'm reading comments as I'm presenting as well. Sometimes that can be a real challenge to do that. So if you find out that, for example, that you're not able to monitor the chat and the comments and so forth that are coming up, well, assign that to someone else. Experiment with virtual green screens. Sometimes with virtual green screens can actually give you kind of a background effect. Well, you can actually see it on my green screen. Actually, I'll turn it like this. Maybe experimenting with a virtual green screen. And one of the websites that I really enjoy for finding short videos is called Pexels.com. Pexels.com, that it can allow you to create those type of effects. And then the last thing I would say is using the polling feature. And this is when I mentioned about the polling feature within Zoom. I think it's an underutilized feature that teachers can use to actually assess how students are feeling about the lessons and so forth. I think there are some ideas here. Again, people are mentioning about the background, talking about Google goggles. Talking about cut up cup, again, that's it's a really simple way of creating a simple tripod. So the last thing I want to talk about is about the application of these ideas. And I think there are many teachers that are afraid, if I'm not using all the latest microphones and technologies, how will I be viewed amongst my colleagues? So my feeling is, number one, don't penalize or stigmatize teachers who are not using the technologies the way that you are. Or supporting other teachers and may feel unneeded embarrassment for falling a little bit behind. I don't know how many of you felt that at all. Feel like, oh, I'm being evaluated as to whether I'm using technology or not in different ways. So we want to be very careful about that. And I think right now, since the pandemic era, at least the teachers with whom I have been engaging and working with, many of them feel just overwhelmed, and the idea of taking on something else, a new technology, can just be so difficult. So this leads into the next point I want to share is reimagining the traditional paradigm of teacher training and how this is looking. And someone is mentioning there's a lot of shame attached to not using technology. Absolutely. And we want to avoid that idea. I got it from Pixels. Very good. Nancy mentions that she's used that as well. Again, Pixels is for that virtual video backgrounds, and they can really add to the effect of your presentation, especially if you're trying to create some type of mood. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that your classroom is going to be better. Using it judiciously. The next point I want to share is about reimagining the traditional paradigm of teacher training, because one of the challenges, at least during the pandemic era, and I would be interested in hearing from you, how did your preparation load increase because of the pandemic? I know we had many part-time teachers that were preparing 10, 12 hours a day. And the idea of sitting down with a traditional teacher training meeting was just almost impossible. So what I want to share a few ideas on teacher training is professional development cannot be part of the solution until it is no longer part of the problem. This is before the pandemic era and even today. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you found that you may have gone to teacher training that was not relevant to your needs, too generic, too short, focused on novelty tools that were really not needed, too much information in one setting, and no specific process to determine outcomes. So what I want to share with you is a couple of ideas. Number one, with teacher training is recognize that teachers are human beings with skills to be developed. They are not problems to be fixed. Sometimes we think that teachers need to be fixed, and that's just not the case, because what happens, we begin to blame shift. We begin to blame teachers for the struggles that they have. And sometimes one of the things I would always encourage people to avoid is drop-in training model. And that's why we're actually bringing on Sue and Sandra and Ramin in a few minutes to share their experiences, because there is a danger of inviting someone like me kind of parachute into this new setting to actually give you some ideas that may not even be relevant to your situation. And then I'm airlifted out a few hours later and then leaving you in the trenches to say, you know what, that training was not relevant to me. So one of the things that I want to share is, number one, no drive-through window workshops. In other words, that a workshop that is just kind of given and with the hope that teachers will be able to process it. In other words, you need to think about providing long-term, sustainable, cumulative practice that's embedded into everything that you do. The other idea is avoid a lecture model with marathon sessions that you're watching a PowerPoint, 500 slide PowerPoint shown in 15 minutes. It just doesn't work at all. Some ideas that are coming in, someone is mentioning going back to a little bit about green screens, sometimes long hours in the beginning. I think someone is mentioning about their experience, total mind numbing. I really enjoy, that type of feeling. Exponentially, someone mentions 10,000% their actual load in teaching. So what I'm suggesting is, instead of giving the types of training that we're doing in the past, we need to think about other ways of giving them in small, digestible chunks. In other words, maybe within your organization, assign mentors that can coach other teachers, but in small little pieces. In other words, today we're going to have a Zoom meeting, and the 10 minutes that are going to show is that we're going to be showing how to use breakout groups effectively. Rather than sharing, today we're going to spend 3 hours on how to use Zoom, and you realize that these teachers don't have 3 hours. They don't have that time. They have time for 10 minutes, but nothing much longer. One of the things that I also have done during the pandemic, it would be something I might encourage you to do, is I started through social media, reaching out to teachers from around the world. And we started organizing short meetings once a month in which teachers from different places, again, I met them through social media and so forth, actually came up with an idea. Oh, let's spend 1 hour this month talking about how to teach grammar more effectively. And each teacher would take 5 minutes to share their ideas. Something very simple, something very short. But the idea of doing this is allow teachers from around the world to share things that they had in common, if they found universal principles of teaching and training, which I think were important. So the idea that I wanted to share about teacher training is keeping things very short in small chunks, sometimes doing this within your organization, but also considering doing this, finding people through social media and elsewhere where you can actually build connection with different people. And a presentation like this, or the conference that is being held today, allows people to do that. And I would encourage people to join that networking room, I believe, that Zoom room that is being created for people to network with other people, which I think is important. The next topic I'd like to share with you is about learning and practicing the language of empathy. And what I want to share with you, I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to tell me what you see. And I promise you, there is no gorilla in the picture. Take a look. Here we go. What do you see? Just think about it. Often what teachers will say is, Randall, okay, you said that there is no gorilla. But if I say, how many tigers did you see? You're thinking, well, there might be one tiger, but knowing Randall, there's probably more. Let's take a look again. How many tigers do you see? Look carefully, look carefully, look carefully. Ooh, in the stripes of the tiger, it says the hidden tiger. What I mean by this and sharing this is sometimes teachers misunderstand students, teachers misunderstand other teachers, their perceptions, their feelings, their needs, especially when they struggle emotionally and academically. Imagine how many of you during the pandemic have struggled in balancing family, work, and concerns beyond the awareness of any of your colleagues. I think that happens so often. And so often what we see, and especially during the pandemic, I began to see certain behaviors like students not always showing up, or students turning off their cameras. They had their cameras on, but not off. Or in teacher meetings, I saw some teachers having their cameras on or off. And some of the times I didn't realize that a certain level of anxiety, depression, emotional trauma that was often happening in these teachers' lives and the lives of our students that sometimes I was just not aware of. So during the pandemic, I began to think, be careful of certain stereotypes that really can harm mental pictures that can cause on their own emotional distress. Like, you know how students are from that country, or the most effective teachers are the ones that use these technologies, or all those students are just lazy and can't bother to turn on their cameras. But just like with inattentional blindness, with the idea that I mentioned right from the beginning about not seeing the gorilla right in front of us because we're focusing on the wrong thing. And so one of the things that I've discovered more and more during the pandemic is actually treating students with more dignity and respect, and our own colleagues that must be going through very difficult times. Often people are talking about the golden rule of treating others the way you want to be treated. But one of my favorite books, and this is the resource I want to share, is Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It, because it talks now about the platinum rule of treating others the way that they want to be treated, not the way you want to be treated. Actually, we extend ourselves, our compassion and our interest out beyond ourselves, beyond our egocentric worldview, and start to treat people a little bit differently. So the new perspective I would share is, number one, let me first understand your needs, your situation, your story, and I will try to treat you in the same way you want to be treated. With this idea in mind, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you a story that you've probably all are aware of. And this happened, and again, another study in inattentional blindness of being so unaware, that in January of 2007, a man wearing a baseball cap and just regular clothes in Washington, D.C., went into the subway with a violin and for 45 minutes played classical music, of course, on his violin. 1,097 people passed by him. But of the 1,097 people that passed by him, only 7 people stopped. And what they didn't realize is that the person that they had passed by was a man named Joshua Bell, a world famous violinist who only 3 days before was in a concert hall playing to well over 1,000 people who had paid $100 to listen to him. In other words, is that sometimes when we're not expecting, sometimes when you're not expecting great music, when you're not expecting pain or struggle, sometimes we pass by without seeing that, and we often ignore or are just not aware of the greatness that teachers and students bring to the table. But often, sometimes we're so unaware of what is happening in our students' lives. So throughout the pandemic, I just became more aware of that, some of the struggles. Again, the platinum rule, I think, is so important. That is important to us. The last thing I want to share with you is, first of all, I want to talk about how can you become more connected? How can you develop more empathy for your students and so forth? And one of the services I use is called Mentimeter.com, Mentimeter.com. And this is actually designed not for developing empathy per se, but it actually is a service, kind of like some of you probably heard of Poll Everywhere, where it allows you, for example, to create polls and share with your students. And one of the things that I have done is that at the institute where I work, our sessions are 8 weeks long. And so what I do is that every 4 weeks, so halfway through the session, I create a simple poll asking a variety of different questions. Some of you might already do this. This is one example in my grammar class. But what it does is it allows me to have students tell me their feelings about what they like, what they dislike. I had one student that told me, you know what, Randall, I don't like being forced to work in groups. And then I started to think about it, of the way I was engaging the students and so forth. This allows me an opportunity to find out. Again, Mentimeter.com. It's used for different ways, but it's allowed me to tap more into the feelings of the students in the things that they do. So what is the application for this? My feeling is learning about others, their lives, validating their struggles and their perspectives, I think is so important. And I'm not just speaking about students. I'm speaking about teachers who are also deeply struggling, sometimes beyond. And I probably could ask all of you, are there things in your lives today that there is no way, even if a person paid you $100, would you share that with another individual? Maybe, maybe not. But I found in working with other teachers and students, I need to earn the right to hear their story. The last thing I want to, and again, in relation to this, sit with people in their discomfort and pain, seek to understand their struggles, because often those are beyond our awareness. The last I want to share with you before we actually bring on Sue and Sandra and Ramin is the idea of daring greatly. And I want to share with you my family. This is my son, Michael, my wife, Shirley, and me. And this was about 8 years ago. We all enjoy running, trail running specifically. And if you notice my son, he's holding up first place ribbon. My wife in his age group, my wife, first place ribbon. And I'm holding up a rock and a bloody sock. And what this is that I've enjoyed trail running for many years. This race was called the Gruesome Grizzly Race because what they do is they give an award to the runner that's the most injured when they finish. And actually, as I was running along with my wife, I fell twice. I hit my foot on a rock twice. Again, trail running has its own obstacles. And what happened is when I got to the finish line, my my toe was bleeding. I'm not going to show you what my toe looked like, but it wasn't pretty. But one of the things that I realized is even in difficult situations, what can you do to adapt? What can you do to adjust? Because in 1 week's time from this event, my wife and I were going to run a marathon. So what did I do? I had to adapt. So I took my running shoe and I cut out my toe was still oozing a little bit, but I cut out the top of my toe so that I could adapt, so I could continue to running and to participating and just keep going. And one of the things that I find is that teachers are in the same way, very chameleonic. We change, we can adapt to new situations. It's not always easy. It can be very difficult. It can be very painful to do that. But if you think, and the ideas that I've shared today is trying to change and adapt. Being chameleonic, I think, is really important. So going back to the beginning, perhaps in some ways we might be emerging out of a deep, difficult period of time. But one of the things that I think for me, there are certain things that I used to do in the past before the pandemic that I'll never do again in terms of teaching and using technology, because I find that the mind, once stretched by a new idea, never regains its original dimensions. We'll never go back to the way we were. But as you think about this, don't let other teachers behind. Don't leave other students behind, because we should be asking ourselves, how can we help each other stretch and enlarge beyond our current skills in this new era? So thinking about the ideas that I've shared today, and again, someone's mentioning the idea of chameleonic. Again, thank you for sharing down some ideas that are being shared throughout the broadcast. Number one, again, realizing that we could be wrong, being open to learning new things, being authentic and vulnerable, because when we wear a mask of inauthenticity, we really can't find others who are struggling as well. Using technology judiciously and working with other teachers, reimagining the traditional paradigm of teaching in short little chunks of and becoming mentors to others, learning and practicing the language of empathy, and daring greatly are the things that I wanted to share today. Dare greatly, become chameleonic, and I think we could change the lives of our students, the lives of those around us, and teachers with whom we engage every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Randall. I took a lot of notes. There were a lot of comments in the chat. Great, wonderful. Thanks. Okay, well, I think I'm going to introduce our three panelists who are going to take part in a short discussion with you right now, Randall. We've got Sandra Banke from Portland Community College, ESOL instructor. We've got Sue Mosier from Portland Community College, also ESOL instructor. And we've got Ramin Toki. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I forgot to ask you. Okay. Yes. Founder and CEO of Taurus, and also ESL instructor, and more. Short introductions for everybody. We're going to hear from you, learn more about you as you, oh yeah, Sue, we're going to turn your camera on, sorry, so we can see you. We've got some questions. I think Lily's gonna, yeah, there she is. Okay. I'm gonna turn my camera off and allow you three to talk with Randall. Again, audience, you can be commenting in the chat. You
Please
can be
do.
participating as well. Thank you.
Today, what we're going to do for the next 15 minutes is I thought it was really important to bring on Sandra and Sue and Ramin, who are working in your local area, to share their perspectives in relationship to a few questions that I have, but also maybe in connection with any of the comments I've made as well. So we're just going to have a conversation on this idea. I have the questions, and any of you that are watching, feel free to use the chat feature to comment as well. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. And again, if there's anything relevant to your teaching or your context, because I know Sandra and Sue, you're working at the community college, is that correct? Okay, and now Ramin is working on his own organization, a nonprofit, and so we'll weave in some of those ideas. So first of all, real quickly, what is one word that you can only use one word? It can be hyphenated if you like. One word to describe your pandemic experience. And we'll do with Sandra and Sue to begin.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the chat. The first month or so of pandemic teaching was mind-numbing. I would wake up in the morning, I would start working, and then all of a sudden it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And where did the time go?
Okay, so mind-numbing. Sue.
I would have to say life-altering.
Life-altering. Very good. And then we're going to talk more about this. And Ramin, what is your one word?
Oh, change.
Change. Okay, so life altering and change. And with that in mind, and anyone who is watching, feel free to share, the word that best described that. So let's talk about the next question is, in what ways has your personal or professional life been affected, evolved, been altered because of the pandemic? Let's start with Ramin and then we'll talk to Sandra.
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to thank you all for this opportunity to share my experiences as a lifelong learner and educator of languages. With respect to the question, I think on a personal note, this change has been really challenging because when I taught in the real world, the kinds of relationships and connections and engagements that I would develop with the learners were profound. And it just doesn't feel the same, online. And so that's something that really, stands out for me on a personal note. And of course, just not being able to connect with friends, go out, also has been really challenging. On a professional note, for me, I think we have gained a lot of, new teaching techniques, tools, ideas for how to teach effectively, not only in person, but now online. And I think a lot of the, the skills that we learned during this pandemic are going to be relevant in post-pandemic. And so that's something that's, positive about this pandemic, when it comes to professional skill development.
Right.
And so I would call this, post-pandemic transformations, or, that really requires us to rethink about language development.
Good. Well, thank you, Ramin. And again, thank you for being vulnerable to share some of the challenges you've had. Sandra, and then we'll bring in Sue.
Well, a couple of the challenges I've had, like at first, and one that I'm still kind of dealing with, is that the personal and the professional have kind of melded. The boundaries between your professional life and your private life when you're working from home kind of don't exist anymore. And so it's been a real challenge to set those boundaries, for your own mental health. But more specifically, professionally, I feel like actually through Zoom and doing a lot of the online like department meetings and Coffee and Connect and ORTESOL and different things, I actually feel more connected to some of my colleagues that I would never see normally, and I get a chance to talk to them on Zoom when I wouldn't really get a chance to talk to them maybe during, pre-pandemic. And then finally, I find that with the challenges of online teaching or remote teaching, it's been very inspiring to, it's really made me get out of my shell and look for new and different ways of reaching the students not just with technology, but, you know, how they can become more independent learners on their own, because, you know, you can only spend so much time on Zoom.
Great,
So
great. And
there's
it's
been a lot of yeah.
and thank you for sharing. And Sue, we're going to bring you in here in a second to talk about a new teaching technique or tool. I just want to look at some of the comments. Someone says it's been draining. Another comment says life and work balance has gone out of the window. Someone says, I was always on. There's no off switch. I was always on. You know, like I said, I'm able to connect with colleagues across the college is one important point. So let's talk, Sue. Any thoughts to what Sandra and Rami mentioned, but also perhaps focusing on a new teaching technique or tool that you found most valuable?
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. I think, and thank you so much for all the 6 keys. That was just an amazing presentation. There's a lot to digest there. Connections, I think, is a word that keeps coming up again and again. Excuse me. And I kind of feel like brain connections are changing inside my own head. It just doesn't quite feel the same as it did a couple of years ago. And I think maybe a lot of that is related to technology. I'd been using Zoom for many years to connect with colleagues around the state for some state work, but had never really imagined that that was going to become where I live. It's a whole
Good
new
point.
world. Going to class on Zoom every day, and so that's become important, of course, to figure out how to connect to people through Zoom. I think I'm a pretty relational teacher. Kind of the classroom environment has always been very important to me. Something I start working on from second one. And so trying to figure out how to transfer that into the virtual world has been an amazing challenge. And I find that there's, you know, Zoom and using all the annotate tools and just all the little tricks of kind of how you teach. I hadn't really imagined technology as becoming a way to connect people. Google Slides being one of those ways, and breakout rooms where students can still kind of be working together if they're working on a Google Slide project at the same time. Getting a green screen, and I'm so excited about the tech tips today. I'm very jealous of your microphone there. I want one. And I obviously need to get a better camera here. My beach scene, I might not actually be on a beach. And then I would say just finally about technology, email has become just almost overwhelming, but certainly more important than it was in the past because there's no more hallway conversations.
And that's great. You were talking about Zoom. I see some comments again coming about we live in Zoom. And just on a real quick personal note, we had a family member during the pandemic that suffered traumatic brain injuries, paralyzed from the neck down, and is in a long-term rehab. And the only way we could connect was through Zoom. We were not allowed to visit because of, you know, COVID restrictions. And the only thing we could do is to have, you know, an iPad to be able to connect with that family member. And that was really helpful. I see some other things coming in, email, what's up, and so forth. Managing email is intense. To the same question, let me actually, real quickly, new teaching technique, Sandra, and then Ramin, in addition to Zoom that Sue mentioned.
New teaching techniques.
Or it could be anything. It could be a new technique with a new tool.
I was thinking about tools, actually.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Some really simple tools that I have just come to love.
Less is more. Less is more.
Since I've worked, well, I love the snipping tool. I'm sorry, it's really simple, but it allows me, like especially when I'm teaching a digital skills class and I have to explain, okay, this is how you respond in chat, you know, and just doing that immediate capture and then being able to show it to the students. Really simple stuff. Screenshots.
Simple, but important and life-changing.
Right. Screenshots and screencasting. Screencasting actually has been a lifesaver. So, you know, trying to show a student, you know, how to save a Google Doc and how to send me their homework, you know, it's difficult to do on Zoom itself because you're in Zoom, right? So doing it with screencasting has been really, really helpful. And then within Zoom, I just really love annotating. I've discovered that that's like when you're sharing the screen, that's like your whiteboard, right? And so, you know, we're discussing vocabulary and I can put something over here and over here and over here. So really a lot of just simple technological tools, but they've really changed how I've taught on, or they've really helped how I've taught on Zoom.
And thank you, Sandra, for sharing. And any of you that are using particular tools, feel free to put a URL or other resource in the chat so that we can actually make reference to that. So that was great, Sandra. Ramin, any thought on that? Any particular teaching tool? And Sandra, I appreciate you mentioning less is more. It doesn't have to be like breakout rooms for, 200 people, but thank you for sharing that. Ramin, for you.
Yeah, for us, as a community-based organization, really Zoom has been, a blessing, because even though we focus on one-on-one sessions, our group classes are multi-level. And so using, for example, a breakout room feature of Zoom has been really effective at dividing, beginners from high levels. That has been really helpful for us. Remote control, another feature of Zoom, has been also helpful to use for document search activity, for example.
Right.
When you give the power to the learner to find certain words that you say to find. Those two features of the Zoom has been really amazing for us. Outside of Zoom, I think for us, WhatsApp. So we use WhatsApp as a communication-based app. We use it to communicate to our learners because most of them use that app as well. And so, it's allegedly end-to-end encrypted. And so allegedly a lot of the conversations are, safe to have in that space. And so we've been really grateful to use that app as well.
And and thank you for sharing that, talking about breakout rooms, especially for classes where you have different levels. A lot of times teachers are thinking about, oh, I'm working with level 3 and level, in one class, level 4 and a different, but in your particular program, you might have, a class of 20 people and they're all multi-levels. And so that idea of using it in that way, thank you, Ramin, for mentioning it. I think that's a great idea. Couple of thoughts to close out today. Again, we're seeing some ideas coming into the chat. Please take a look at those. Mentioning, I love the chat feature. Someone are saying reactions feature, I think, is really key. And going back to teacher training, rather than saying, hi, everyone, we're going to have a 2-hour training meeting over Zoom on 5 different features. It just might be that annotation feature. Let's talk about all of the possibilities with that and nothing else. To the last question, so what does the future look like 10 years from now? And do you think you will still be a part of it? So let's start with Sue on that idea, Soon, and then Sandra. Again, what does the future look like for teaching and learning? And do you think that you'll be a part of that?
Well, if that bus coming down the street spares me, I will be. I hope to be here 10 years from now. I think we're in a time now where predictions about the future feel almost impossible. I would imagine that 10 years from now will be something that I can't even envision. It's easy to go to holographic. I've had that thought. Wouldn't it be cool if I could just have all my students right in front of me at their virtual desks in some kind of holographic environment? I have no idea what that would look like. But I would imagine that this path that we're on, where kind of individuation, we're getting more and more and more individualized and serving individual needs. I would imagine that trend would continue.
Great. And Sandra, we have about 3 minutes left, but let's see if we can get in a couple more comments from you and from Rami.
I'll try to keep it short. So I see the future of teaching as being much more hybrid. So we're not going to be completely in the classroom anymore. I can see myself easily using some of these Zoom tools and other things that I've started using while teaching remotely once I'm back in the classroom, not just to supplement, but also, to really, to put actually more responsibility on the students so they can learn how to be independent learners at home and accessing some of these tools. So yeah, my one-word answer is it'll be hybridized, and I hope to be part of it. I think it's really invigorating to find, it's always exciting to find a new tool or a new toy. toy to use in your classroom.
Great. And Ramin, thank you, Sandra. Ramin, last thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with Sandra. I would call this, post-pandemic transformations. I think it really requires us to rethink about language development. And I agree that, it's going to be hybrid. And, at least for us as an organization, as a community-based organization, we're going to be utilizing online spaces and we're going to be offering in-person classes. And so I think the future is hybrid.
Thank you. And one of my favorite books is Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools. I think it's a great idea talking about blended, hybrid learning and so forth. That is certainly, I think during times of disruption, this type of turmoil can lead, as you mentioned, transformation, accelerated innovation, and growth. Well, thank you very much for joining this plenary. It was a pleasure, especially Sandra, Sue, and Ramin, and all of those that shared your comments. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being a part of this session. And we certainly want you to enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so very much, Randall, and our plenary panelists. That was a great conversation. I feel like it could have gone on a lot longer, but we always want to leave them wanting more. So let those thoughts simmer and percolate and take that energy into the rest of our day. We have a little transition time right now. It's 10:20. 10:30 will be our first sessions. Will be starting. Remember, you can pop into the hospitality room if you need help. You can email me. You can email Lily. Randall has made his email available if you want to contact him afterwards. And enjoy the rest of your day. I wish we were here in person, but I think we're as close as we can get right now. So thank you again.
Take care, everyone.